During his journey to paradise, Dante meets the luminous specter of a former empress. Though once she had sat on the highest throne of Europe, here she found herself on the lowest heavenly sphere, among the pious but inconstant spirits gliding across the surface of the changeless, changing moon. Had the former empress not forsaken her vow of celibacy and given in to the pressure to marry for power, she would have earned a spot closer to the Empyrean, way out past the moon and sun and all the stars and planets. Instead, the divine ledger records that in her 40th winter, on the 26th of December, 1194, Constance I delivered her only child inside a tent pitched on the piazza of Assisi. There was no hiding a birth as strange as this one, not from the attendants, midwives, or bystanders, and certainly not from the eye of the Creator. Yet in this moment of maternal innocence, there was also no attempt to hide it either. On the contrary, Constance believed the birth to be a miracle, and wanted all of Europe to know that a future emperor had been born. Not long after that, the rumors were already swirling. Some suspected the boy of being fathered by a falconer, others a butcher, and then there were those with even stranger suspicions. They said the boy was swapped at birth, and that the empress was not even his true mother. That is why Constance returned to the piazza to nurse the babe, and possessed with the only sinless form of pride there is, that of a mother, she gave her boy the august name Constantine, the male equivalent of Constance. After a baptism in Assisi, the princeling got another name. He was christened Frederick in honor of his paternal grandfather, the red-bearded Crusader Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Yet soon the boy would be among the last of this great lineage. His parents died mysteriously early, leaving little Frederick the most important orphan in Europe. How he then survived the snake pits of Italy and the beast dens of Germany is anyone's guess. But more and more suspected something divine or diabolical at work. One way or another, the boy became a king, and the king became an emperor. His predecessors had been some of the most celebrated monarchs in all the Middle Ages, none more so than his very namesake. Yet as his reign progressed, this second Frederick proved to be another beast entirely, his feats defying the constraints of medieval space and time. Here was someone Nietzsche called the first European, a Renaissance man before the Renaissance, a scientist before the scientific method, an enlightened despot before the Age of Enlightenment. Here was a scholar, as interested in all that surrounded him as he was proficient in all that he attempted, whether it was astrology or zoology or any subject A through Z in the Codex of Creation. Here was a maestro, as comfortable in matters of science as he was in those of art, schooled in life's finer things like poetry, music, and architecture. Here was a six-tongued linguist, deceiving priests in Greek and Latin, charming dancing girls in Arabic, and conducting diplomacy in the old forms of French, German, and Italian. Here was a hunter, a sportsman, a lover, who fathered almost 24 children with 3 wives and countless concubines, a collector of people and animals, whose menagerie included elephants, cheetahs, giraffes, and the colorful birds he so liked to hunt and study. Here was an author with a codex of his own, his treatise on falconry bucking the age-old wisdom of Aristotle. In sum, here was a man ahead of his time, one of thought and action, who never met anyone or anything he could or did not master. Yet there were those who insisted that their suzerain was not a man at all, and in hushed tones they reasoned that if he seemed ahead of his time, it's because he was from another time, and that if he knew so much, it's because he'd lived it all before, and that if his birth seemed strange, it's because he was begotten by the devil himself. After all, who else but the son of Satan would go to such lengths to decode God's riddles? Who else would subject unbaptized infants to solitary confinement? This so he might uncover the original language of Eden. Who else would have his victims sealed in a wine cask and starved to death? This so he might see whether the dead man's soul escaped through a hole in the barrel. Who else would have 2 other victims sup with him, sending one to sleep, one to hunt, and having them both disemboweled, so he might learn how best to digest his prey? Who else indeed but the Antichrist, whose many names and many guises were discarded for one brief moment in time, when, in the 13th century, Frederick II lived and reigned. Today, I'll be playing devil's advocate and bringing you a true account of Frederick's life and times, because believe me when I say that the facts are just as interesting as the legends.
We attribute the success to mankind.
Let us begin with the child, the father of the man. Already, he knew how to put on a show. Due to his unlikely birth and untimely orphaning, he quickly became known as the son of Apulia, and has ever since been cast in the role of a self-reared orphan prince. That's the portrait his most colorful biographer, Ernst Kantorowicz, paints in the following excerpt. Quote, Frederick II was not brought up, as his father for instance had been, by a learned chaplain, nor reared like many another prince by Rho Chi monks in the seclusion of a cloister. He is a typically self-taught man. He had no one to thank for his education. What he was sua virtute. His later learning bears all the marks of being not the product of school, but of life itself. He was compelled from his tenderest years to absorb directly, without extraneous aid and from every source, the strength he needed. This differentiated his knowledge, both in its content and in its application, from that of his contemporaries. Stern necessity was his first tutor, and his next instructors were the marketplaces and streets of Palermo. Life itself. End quote. Life itself, then. A good story, but with one little problem. Based on correspondence from this period, we know that little Frederick received about the princeliest education you could get in that era, the reason being that he had someone looking out for him. But who? Well, recall that Frederick was an important boy, his father having been the Holy Roman Emperor and his mother the Queen of Sicily. That made him the descendant of not one, but 2 great families, the German Hohenstaufens on his father's side and the Norman Hautevils on his mother's. But though his inheritance was vast, encompassing most of Germany and Italy, this boy of 3 had little hope of ever claiming it all. Between the striving city-states, power-hungry popes, and malarial outbreaks, Italy was a region known to be lethal to German kings and emperors. In fact, it is probably malaria that claimed the life of Frederick's father. The boy king was thankfully spared that fate, growing up healthy and strong, under the on-again, off-again guardianship of Pope Innocent III. It is surely one of history's finest ironies that this Antichrist in the making owed as much as he did to a pope. But first and foremost, he had his mother Constance to thank, for it was her will and testament that conferred little Frederick to the best stepmom she could think of, the Holy Mother Church. In those days, the settlement between popes, kings, and emperors was still being negotiated and renegotiated, though nominally, the popes were in charge ever since their bloodless victory at Canossa. In keeping with his name, Pope Innocent treated the top job description literally. In his words, quote, God instituted 2 great dignities, a greater one to preside over souls as if over day, and a lesser one to preside over bodies as if over night. These are the pontifical authority and the royal power. Now, just as the moon derives its light from the sun, and is indeed lower in quantity and quality, in position and power, so too the royal authority derives the splendor of its dignity from the pontifical authority. End quote. Innocent knew that with great power comes great responsibility, and that with great responsibility comes the occasional opportunity. The boy would be under his protection, yes, but he would also be his pawn, and if someone else came along to steal the German half of Frederick's inheritance, so much the better. That way, the papacy would avoid the nightmare scenario of being encircled by a single ruler. In 1198, the very year that Frederick became an orphan, a decade-long civil war broke out to decide the question of German kingship, pitting his Hohenstaufen, or Ghibelline uncle, Philip, against Richard the Lionheart's nephew, Otto, who belonged not to the Plantagenets, but to the Welfs, or Guelphs, an old family dating back to the age of Charlemagne. It did not take long for this feud to become an affair of continental significance, a proxy fight for the English, French, and countless Italian communes. For the moment, the young king of Sicily was safe under the care of the papal agent Censio, way down south in Palermo. But Frederick's guardian could only do so much, and soon the son of Apulia would be like a lamb amongst ravening wolves. By 1201, one such ravening wolf was at his door, unleashed by none other than Frederick's uncle Philip. Already, the 7-year-old Frederick showed a capacity for action, getting his clothes torn up and fingernails bloody while confronting his uncle's men. According to Kantorowicz, the colorful biographer we turned to earlier, it was at this point that Frederick's self-education project began. Quote, "Afterwards, no one in the fortress seems to have bothered his head about the boy. The royal property had been so shockingly squandered that the child was often literally in want of the barest necessaries, till the compassionate citizens of Palermo took pity on him and found him food. One fed him for a week, another for a month, each according to his circumstances. At 8 and 9 years old, the young king wandered about without let or hindrance, and strolled unchecked through the narrow streets and markets and gardens of the semi-African capital at the foot of the Pellegrino." End quote. For context, Palermo was then a medieval metropolis with Byzantine columns, Kufic scripts, and Mesolithic cave paintings. A city that rivaled any in Christendom, with the notable exception of Constantinople. This Sicilian capital entombed the dead fathers of antiquity and the mute phantoms that came before them. In Frederick's time, the city was thronged with Normans, Italians, Greeks, Slavs, Jews, Arabs, and Berbers, who rubbed shoulders on their way to churches, synagogues, and mosques. Writes Kantorowicz, quote, "Round the town lay the pleasure palaces and fountains of Norman kings, and the exotic gardens and animal preserves of the Conca d'Oro, the delights of which had inspired the Arab poets." End quote. Perhaps, he suggests, Frederick was schooled by some alleyway philosopher, a monk or an imam who played the role of a Chiron to Achilles, or an Aristotle to Alexander the Great. In all likelihood, a royal charge like Frederick was kept under lock and key. But who knows? Because of the breakneck pace of Italian politics, control of the little king changed hands not once, not twice, but 3 times before finally reverting to Pope Innocent III. In the chaos of it all, who's to say that Frederick did not enjoy a few youthful excursions? In any case, by the close of 1208, the king had turned 14, officially reaching his majority under the tutelage of yet another papal legate. Letters exchanged between him and the Pope reveal a more traditional education than has otherwise been suggested. Yet even Frederick's soberest biographer, David Abulafia, admits that the king showed promise. He writes, quote, "Frederick was highly literate, for he was a great reader of histories. No doubt legends of Alexander more than monastic chronicles. A very accomplished writer, who also understood the value of bloodstock. A good fighter, with both the sword and the bow. He showed enormous industry and energy, exercising both mind and body relentlessly." Later observers rudely remarked how little money would be paid for such a physique in the slave markets of Africa. But in his adolescence, he seems to have been sturdy enough, only of moderate height admittedly, something that detracted little from his kingly presence, but strong. Not perhaps very handsome, but bearing a spirited expression, like the young David, red-haired and perhaps rather florid of face. Later his eyesight seems to have deteriorated, probably plain myopia, but this did not discourage him from his enthusiasm for hunting with birds, where keen sight might be expected to matter. End quote. Now that Frederick was legally a man, the time to claim his other legacy was fast approaching. In the same year he celebrated his coming of age, he received the news that his uncle Philip had been assassinated. The murder was carried out by a German nobleman acting of his own accord. It was a strange event for a number of reasons: the convenient timing, the seemingly trivial motive, and the simple fact that medieval regicide was not nearly as common as people think. Kings would die all the time when their blood was hot, but cold-blooded murder was a rare thing indeed. In the aftermath, it wasn't Frederick who inherited Germany, but his uncle's Guelph rival, Otto, who had already gotten a royal coronation in Aachen and now received an imperial one in Rome. The trouble arose when the newly crowned emperor revealed his designs on the Kingdom of Sicily. Brushing past the medieval question of birthright, he justified himself on the basis of an older territorial legacy, that of the Roman Empire. By 1210, Otto had seized control of most of the peninsula, and Frederick found himself trapped in Palermo once again. The situation got so desperate that a barge was kept in the port so that Frederick could evacuate to Africa if Otto made a move. Yet the young king of Sicily still had a guardian angel, the Pope. While it's true that Innocent had previously supported Otto over Philip, his former ward Frederick still held a special place in his heart, and he didn't want Otto encircling the Eternal City. That is why the Pope had the emperor excommunicated. In 1211, the teenage Frederick was elected anti-king in absentia at the Diet of Nuremberg. Germany now had two kings once again, and since they were both currently in Italy, the race to the fatherland was about to begin. Round 2 in the feud between Welfs and Hohenstaufens, or Guelphs and Cabellans. Eluding the Guelph-aligned fleet of Pisa, Frederick found solace in the arms of its envious sister city, Genoa. He spent 2 months in this hub of proto-capitalism, negotiating trade rights, debt repayments, and other such matters before proceeding to Germany. Yet the Guelphs were still on the prowl, this time the Milanese, who intercepted the king and his Pavian escort on the banks of the river Lambro. Most of the Pavians were killed on the spot, and Frederick just barely managed to escape after commandeering a horse and riding bareback at breakneck speed. Though the king had to bathe his bottom in the Lambro, in the euphemism of one chronicler, he had gotten away. Proceeding past Cremona, Mantua, and Verona, Frederick made his way through the Alps, outmaneuvering the pro-Guelph Bavarians stationed along the pass. By the close of 1212, this papal protege had made it to Germany with 300 horsemen supplied by the clergy. But the clock was ticking, since Otto himself had arrived as well. The excommunicant was en route to Constance, hoping to nip Frederick's expedition in the bud by trapping him in southern Germany. So confident was Otto of reaching the city in time that he had his cook sent ahead to prepare a banquet for his arrival. Frederick managed to beat him there by a couple of hours, appearing before the city gates out of nowhere, while Otto tarried on the other side of Lake Constance. At first, the local bishop refused to grant Frederick entry, but eventually, the intercession of the Pope's legate won the bishop over, and the city of Constance opened her gates to the golden child of Apulia. It's been said that if Frederick arrived just 3 hours later, Germany would have never been his. Once again, the boy king had his guardian, Pope Innocent, to thank for the victory. But by the time of Frederick's royal coronation in Germany, the Pope was finally getting wise to the fact that he may have struck a deal with the devil. Hey everybody, thanks as always for watching. There's no sponsor for today's video, so I just want to take this opportunity to thank the patrons who chose today's topic. This is only the first chapter in a 3-part series, and the next 2 are already researched and written. As soon as they're edited, I plan to make those parts available early to patrons. So, if you're in a position to support this channel financially, head on over to Patreon so you can cash in on that perk, as well as the others listed on screen. If that's not something you can commit to right now, no worries. Your time and attention still mean the world to me. So, thanks to everyone who made it this far, and stay tuned for chapters 2 and 3 in the next couple of months.